Okay, so the last time you saw anything on my project, it should have looked like this. I did a video on day 4 of the guys' episodes that I've been watching. And really wasn't a game yet because it's just a bunch of letters popping around, but we had E's that represented 3 enemies. We had a P that's bouncing around that represents the player. And we had this canvas that kind of contained all these elements. So I'm going to do this a little bit different than I've done the other weeks because if I go through all of his episodes, I think there's like 13 or 14, that's going to really not mean that I have much progress done by the time we potentially are back in school on April 30th or May 1st or whatever the date is at this point. So I'm going to do 3 games or 3 days worth of stuff, which I've had these done for a while anyway. But if I just kind of go through each one of these and show you the kind of changes that come to my game, and I'll point out some of the major code that kind of popped up that helped with some of these features. So if I go to the next days, it doesn't really look like much happened, but if you have, this over here, if you have, I had to use my personal Gmail account for Chrome to get this to work because apparently it's blocked on the school accounts. But what's happening here, one of the big things that happened is I'm now testing whether my player collides with any of the enemies. So what I noticed down here is every once in a while in what's called the console, it's kind of just a place that messages can pop up. You can use it to see if things are working simply like this. You can use it for testing pretty much. What I notice is whenever the player hits something, you can see colliding pop up. So if we take a look at how we can tell if some of these things collide. So if I look at day 5, I have this function in here that's called test collision entity and also get distance between entity. So right now we're kind of treating these as points, more or less. And what I do every time that the screen refreshes, like every 40 milliseconds, I run this update function and it tests whether my player is hitting any of the enemies in my list. So it calls the test collision entity, which creates a variable called distance. And then that will let you get the distance between 2 entities. So one of these will be the player, one of them will be the enemy, and it just subtracts their x and y values, figures out the distance using Pythagorean theorem. This is another way to write a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and solve for c. Take the square root of the x squared and the y squared. And if that distance is less than 30, then we assume that you're colliding. Because the text or the font is roughly 30 pixels wide. That's why we kind of went with a distance of 30. So if it does that, it's going to put in that console, it's going to say that it had a collision. Now that's all that it does. It doesn't bounce off of anything. It doesn't take away HP. All it says is, hey, you collided. So I think that's where the difference comes in on day 6. Now I have this thing up here, HP or hit points, that if I collide with one of my little green enemies, it takes those away. And you can notice that if you lose, it goes back up to 10. I haven't gotten it to stop on 10 yet. There we go. So you always start with 10. Obviously, it doesn't say, hey, you should really get better. You lost. Let's try again. It just starts over at 10. The other big change here is we actually have not letters anymore. We have actual objects, little green enemies, and a red player. Plus, that red player doesn't go around on its own anymore. It follows my mouse. That's another big change. So let's take a look at some of day 6's changes quickly. Okay. So a couple new functions is I draw the player differently. So if it's an enemy, it's going to be green. That tells it the color that it's going to be made, and it's going to be a rectangle. And I just take the object x, subtract 15, meaning I put the square in the middle of the point, and it's going to be 30 by 30 square. And all this minus 15 stuff does is kind of centers the square. So it's not kind of bouncing off the screen randomly or halfway off when it hits the edge of the screen. Same thing with the player. It tells it to be red. It subtracts 10 from each side because that's half of the size of the player, which you noticed was smaller. The other thing that happened is there's a event handler, which pretty much means something happened from the user standpoint, like I moved my mouse, or you could have a key press event, a click event, like on mouse click. I don't know if that's what it is in JavaScript or not, but that makes sense to me. But all I do here is whenever I move my mouse, your computer can recognize that input, that movement, and it will tell you actually in JavaScript, it's called the client X. So mouse.clientX tells you where on your screen, how far you are from the left side of the screen. Client Y tells you how far you are from the top of the screen down. And then I set my players X and Y to where the mouse X and Y is. So then when I draw them, I use my X is now where my mouse and was. Right. So that's one of the big changes there. Oh, the HP part. Let's show that part. So now if we remember from before, we created objects. One of those objects was a player. And you can give an object as many attributes or values or variables as you want. We did not create one of these before. I just added an HP. I said that it's going to default to 10. And unlike what we did the last time, whenever you update and you test a collision, before all we had here was the fact that it said you collided in that console. Now what we're doing is we're figuring out how long you've survived by taking the time now, which this is the function for that, minus the start time, which I think I created up here. Start time is when you open that web page or that game, it gets the time at that point. And then it lets you know how long you survived. You will, every time it collides, it takes 1 off of the HP. When you get down to 0, you've lost, and it's going to tell you you lost in the console, which I can pull up in a bit. It sets the HP back to 10, meaning it starts the game over, and it restarts the start time. Right. So time survived is all they do there is it will pop up a message. So let's go back. I didn't have the console open on this one. So we can do that on day 6. Okay, so right now, if I intentionally kick the bucket, it says down here, you lost, you survived for 1.561 seconds. So one thing I notice here is there's an issue with the game because I can just move my mouse off to the side and I'll survive forever. I'll never have a collision. So one thing that, I don't know if it's day 7, we can find out. That's done. No, we didn't fix that on day 7. What do you say? Really? Sure. Okay. So another thing that happened on day 7 is obviously on day 6 we had all the same size squares. Here we have a little bit of an element of randomness. Yeah. Go. I want to burn my chocolate Go. Bunny. Bring it up here then. Okay. Okay. So now we have objects that are not all the same size. Let's see if there's any other different messages that are popping up. No, still the same thing. So let's take a look at the code. There might be more that's going on than what it looks like, but test collision. there was a different function, I don't know if I showed this on the last one or not, that tests for rectangles colliding, because rectangles aren't points. They are obviously a rectangle. They've got a 3D or 2D shape to them. So colliding with a rectangle of a certain size, you kind of got to be able to figure out that collision with the certain size that that rectangle is. So that was kind of the formulas there for figuring that out. Then we have, no, it must be an enemy. No. That's weird.
What weird?
I'm just trying to figure out where the code is actually different in this one. There you go. This might be one of those ones that I didn't actually save the new changes. Oh, there's some new changes. I think it just comes in with this 40. So in enemy, height and width. Okay, that's where it came in. So I actually gave a height and a width property to the enemy list. Right. Weirdly, that seems to be one of the big differences, and it seems like that would have been such a small change that it wouldn't have been worth looking at. So I guess that's all I got for that one. Just gave it a height and a width, which obviously it shows you that those are different shapes. The other thing that came about was, if I'm right next to them, if I follow right next to them, I don't have a collision that occurs. The moment I touch any part of it, even if it's just a little tiny corner, it recognizes a collision and takes off an HP. It still says that you survived for a certain amount right there. Some things that are coming up in some of the next stuff is like a score. You'll have a score up here. Instead of it showing in something that most of you probably didn't even know existed, it's going to display a score. To be perfectly honest, this game right now is ridiculously easy. There's almost no challenge in it at all. You can just kind of move, and really the challenge, the fact that it's easy, comes mostly from the fact that there's only 3 enemies. So in games, a lot of games, you're going to have enemies or players that aren't you that can kind of self-generate, meaning they can make their own enemies. They can make new ones, which kind of ups the intensity or the difficulty of the game. So some things coming up are our ability to make random enemies every certain number of seconds, to keep track of the score, to kind of reset the game a little bit better and just add some better functionality to it. So with that should be 3 days worth of stuff for me, which I'm just going to say is 1 day.